I thought I had seen the worst of human cruelty in my 73 years on this earth. I had survived war, witnessed poverty, and buried more friends than any man should have to. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I discovered behind the old oak tree on that bitter February morning when the snow fell like frozen tears from a gray, unforgiving sky. There, huddled together in a cardboard box that was already soaked through and falling apart, were four of the tiniest creatures I had ever laid eyes upon. Newborn puppies, so young their eyes hadn't even opened yet, shivering against each other in a desperate attempt to share what little warmth their tiny bodies could generate. They couldn't have been more than a few days old, and someone, some heartless soul, had left them there to die in the bitter cold, as if their innocent lives meant nothing at all. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now? And which city or state are you watching from? My name is George Whitman, and I've been walking the same path through Riverside Park every morning for the past 15 years. It started after my wife, Margaret, passed away from cancer in 2008. The doctors had given us 6 months. She fought for 2 years with a grace and courage that still humbles me today. After she was gone, the house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that both comforted and tormented me. So I began walking, every morning at 6:30, rain or shine, through the park that Margaret and I had strolled through during our courtship 50 years earlier. It wasn't about exercise, though my doctor was pleased with that side effect. It was about moving forward, literally and figuratively, when everything in my life felt like it had come to a complete stop. The park in winter was different from the lush green sanctuary it became in spring and summer. In February, it was stark and honest, stripped of all pretense. The bare branches of the trees reached toward the sky like arthritic fingers, and the paths were often slick with ice that made each step a careful negotiation between progress and caution. But there was something peaceful about the winter mornings. The usual joggers and dog walkers were fewer, leaving me mostly alone with my thoughts and the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots. The cold air burned my lungs in a way that made me feel alive, reminded me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of putting one foot in front of the other. I had been a carpenter for most of my working life, building houses and fixing things that were broken. My hands were gnarled now with arthritis, but they still remembered the feel of wood and nails, the satisfaction of creating something solid and lasting. Margaret used to joke that I could fix anything except her cancer. She was right about that. After she died, I tried to stay busy with small projects around the house, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The joy I'd once found in craftsmanship had been buried alongside the woman who made everything worthwhile. I was going through the motions of living without really understanding why. Our house sat on the edge of town, just a 10-minute walk from the park. Margaret and I had bought it in 1975, a small two-bedroom place with good bones and terrible plumbing. Over the years, I'd renovated every inch of it, always with her input and usually with her helping despite my protests. That construction work was no place for a lady. She'd laugh at that, roll up her sleeves, and show me that she could handle a paintbrush or a hammer just as well as any man. Those were some of our happiest times, covered in sawdust and paint, working side by side to make our house into the home where we'd planned to grow old together. We tried for children early in our marriage, but it wasn't meant to be. The doctors had explanations and medical terms, but the simple truth was that Margaret and I were meant to be each other's whole world. She channeled her maternal instincts into teaching third grade at the local elementary school, and I found purpose in building things that would outlast us both. When she got sick, we talked about getting a dog for company, but the treatments were so demanding that we never followed through. Margaret was afraid she wouldn't be able to take proper care of a pet, and I was too focused on taking care of her to think about anything else. Now, 5 years after her death, I lived alone in a house that was too well built to fall apart and too full of love to ever feel truly empty. I'd kept busy with small repairs for neighbors and friends, but mostly I just existed, moving through each day with the methodical precision of a man who had forgotten what it meant to truly live. My daily walks had become a meditation, a way of honoring Margaret's memory while trying to figure out what purpose my remaining years might hold. I talked to her sometimes as I walked, sharing the small observations and thoughts that I would have told her over breakfast if she'd still been there to listen. That Tuesday morning in February started like any other. The weather forecast had promised 6 inches of new snow overnight, and they'd been right for once. The world was blanketed in pristine white, unmarked except for the tracks of early commuters and the occasional bird. The temperature was well below freezing, the kind of cold that made your breath visible and turned your cheeks red within minutes. I was wearing my heavy winter coat, the one Margaret had bought me for Christmas 3 years before she died. It was brown wool with a thick lining, and she'd splurged on it despite my protests about the cost. I still remember her saying that if something happened to her, she wanted to know I'd stay warm. At the time, I'd thought she was being dramatic. Now I understood she'd been preparing for a future I refused to acknowledge. As I walked the familiar path, I noticed how the snow had transformed everything. The benches were rounded hills of white. The playground equipment looked like abstract sculptures, and the trees were dressed in crystal that caught the early morning light like thousands of tiny mirrors. I was about halfway through my usual route when I heard it. At first, I thought it might be a bird or maybe the wind playing tricks in the branches overhead, but as I stopped to listen more carefully, I realized it was something else entirely. It was crying, soft, desperate, barely audible over the whisper of falling snow. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the old oak tree, a massive specimen that had to be at least 100 years old. Margaret and I had often sat on the bench beneath its branches during our courting days, and later we'd brought picnic lunches there during the early years of our marriage. As I approached the tree, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, I was certain of that, but it was definitely the sound of distress, of creatures in need. My heart began to beat faster as I realized that something was seriously wrong. When I rounded the massive trunk of the oak tree, what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. There, partially hidden behind the tree's base, was a soggy cardboard box, the kind that might have held a case of beer or a small appliance, but instead of packaging materials, it contained the most heartbreaking sight I'd ever witnessed. 4 newborn puppies, so tiny they could have fit in my cupped hands, were huddled together in the wet cardboard. Their eyes were still sealed shut, their ears folded tight against their heads. They couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 days old, still bearing the unmistakable helplessness of creatures who had barely begun to exist. They were shivering violently, their tiny bodies pressed together in a futile attempt to share warmth. The cardboard beneath them was soaked through from the melting snow, providing no insulation from the frozen ground. Their small cries were growing weaker by the moment, and I could see that hypothermia was already setting in. One of the puppies, slightly smaller than the others, had separated from the group and lay motionless on its side. For a terrible moment, I thought it might already be too late for that one. But as I knelt down for a closer look, I saw the almost imperceptible rise and fall of its tiny chest, barely alive but still fighting. The sight hit me like a physical blow. What kind of person could do this? What kind of monster could take these innocent, helpless creatures and abandon them to freeze to death in the snow? They were babies, completely dependent on their mother for everything: warmth, food, protection. Without her, they had no chance of survival. I looked around frantically, hoping to see their mother nearby, perhaps searching for her babies or trying to return to them. But the park was empty except for the falling snow and the tracks I'd made in approaching the tree. Whoever had left these puppies here had planned for them to die. As I knelt there in the snow, staring at these four tiny lives hanging by the thinnest of threads, something broke open inside me. It was as if all the grief I'd been carrying for the past 5 years, all the pain and loneliness and sense of purposelessness, suddenly had a focal point. These puppies were as helpless and abandoned as I felt. They were facing death through no fault of their own, victims of someone else's cruelty and indifference. In their tiny, struggling forms, I saw a reflection of my own pain, my own feeling of being lost and forgotten in a world that seemed to have moved on without me. But unlike me, they couldn't choose to keep going or give up. They were completely dependent on chance, on the possibility that someone would find them before it was too late. They were depending on a miracle, and somehow, impossibly, I was supposed to be that miracle. My hands were shaking as I reached toward the box, and not just from the cold. I hadn't held anything this fragile, this precious, since Margaret's last days, when every breath was precious and every moment could be the last. The responsibility was overwhelming. These creatures needed more than I knew how to give. But looking at them, feeling their desperate need radiating up from that soggy cardboard box, I knew I couldn't walk away. I couldn't leave them to die any more than I could have walked away from Margaret when she needed me most. Sometimes life gives you a choice that isn't really a choice at all. Very carefully, I picked up the box, trying not to disturb the puppies any more than necessary. They were so weak that even gentle movement caused them to cry out in distress. The smallest one, the one I'd thought might already be dead, barely responded at all. The box was falling apart in my hands, the wet cardboard dissolving where the snow had soaked through. I needed to get them somewhere warm immediately, but my house was a 10-minute walk away, and I wasn't sure they had 10 minutes left. I unzipped my heavy winter coat and carefully transferred the puppies inside, against my chest where my body heat might help stabilize them. They were so cold they felt like ice against my skin, their tiny bodies barely generating any warmth at all. The walk home was the longest 10 minutes of my life. I could feel the puppies moving weakly against my chest, their small cries muffled by my coat. I talked to them as I walked, the way I used to talk to Margaret during her difficult nights, offering reassurance I wasn't sure I believed myself. "You're going to be okay," I whispered. "I've got you now. You're safe." But even as I said the words, I wondered if they were true. I knew nothing about caring for newborn puppies. I didn't have the right supplies, the right knowledge, or even the right mindset. I was a 73-year-old widower who could barely take care of himself, and now I was responsible for 4 lives that hung by the thinnest of threads. When I finally reached my house, my hands were numb with cold and adrenaline. I fumbled with the keys, my arthritis making the simple task nearly impossible. The puppies had grown quieter during the walk, which worried me more than their earlier crying. Quiet could mean they were warming up and calming down, or it could mean they were slipping away. Inside the house, I went straight to the living room where Margaret and I used to spend our evenings. The fireplace hadn't been lit since the last winter we'd shared, but I quickly got a fire going, needing the warmth more than I'd needed anything in years. While the fire caught and began to throw heat into the room, I gently removed the puppies from my coat and assessed the situation more carefully. In the better light of my living room, I could see that they were mixed breed puppies, probably part Labrador based on their size and the shape of their heads. Their fur was thin and fine, providing almost no protection against the cold. 2 of them were slightly larger and seemed to be responding to the warmth, moving more actively and crying with stronger voices. The third was smaller, but appeared stable. The fourth, the tiny one I'd been most worried about, was barely moving at all. Its breathing was shallow and irregular, and its body felt limp and unresponsive. I had no idea what to do, but I knew I needed help. I called Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, the local veterinarian who had cared for the neighborhood pets for over 20 years. I'd met her a few times at community events, and she'd always struck me as someone who genuinely cared about animals. It was barely 8 in the morning, but she answered on the third ring. When I explained what I'd found and the condition of the puppies, she didn't hesitate. "Bring them in immediately," she said. "Don't wait. Hypothermia can be fatal in newborns, and every minute counts." But first, she gave me instructions for immediate care. Find some soft towels and warm them in the dryer for a few minutes. Create a nest where the puppies can stay together and share body heat. If you have a heating pad, use it on the lowest setting, but put towels between the pad and the puppies so they don't get burned. I didn't have a heating pad, but I had something better. Margaret's electric blanket, the one she'd used during the worst of her treatments when the chemotherapy made her constantly cold. It had been stored in the closet since she died, and I'd never had the heart to donate it or throw it away. Setting up the emergency nursery became an exercise in controlled panic. I gathered every soft towel and blanket I could find, warming them in the dryer and creating a cozy nest on the couch nearest to the fireplace. The electric blanket went underneath, set to the lowest temperature with several layers of towels providing insulation. As I worked, I kept checking on the puppies, monitoring their breathing and response to touch. The two larger ones were definitely improving with the warmth. Their cries were stronger, and they were moving around more actively, searching instinctively for their mother's milk. The third puppy was holding steady, not improving dramatically, but not getting worse either. But the smallest one, the one that had been motionless when I first found them, was still barely clinging to life. Its breathing was so shallow I had to put my ear close to its tiny chest to make sure it was still alive. Dr. Rodriguez's clinic was only a 15-minute drive away, but I knew the puppies weren't strong enough for another trip in the cold. Instead, she agreed to make a house call, something she rarely did but understood was necessary under the circumstances. While I waited for her arrival, I did the only thing I could think of. I held the smallest puppy against my chest, sharing my body heat and talking to it the way I'd talked to Margaret during her worst nights. I told it that it was going to be okay, that help was coming, that it just needed to hold on a little longer. I found myself making promises I wasn't sure I could keep. I promised that puppy it would never be abandoned again, never be cold or hungry or unloved. I promised it would grow up to be strong and healthy, that it would know what it felt like to be truly wanted. As I held that tiny, struggling life against my heart, something shifted inside me. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just getting through each day. These puppies needed me, and maybe, just maybe, I needed them too. Dr. Rodriguez arrived within 40 minutes, carrying a bag of medical supplies and wearing the kind of expression that told me she understood exactly how serious the situation was. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and gentle hands, the sort of person you immediately trusted with the things you cared about most. She examined each puppy carefully, checking their temperature, heartbeat, and reflexes. Her face remained professionally neutral, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she worked. "You found them just in time," she said finally. "Another hour in that cold, and we would have lost all of them. As it is, this little one is still in critical condition." She was referring to the smallest puppy, the one I'd been holding against my chest. Dr. Rodriguez explained that severe hypothermia in newborn puppies could cause organ damage even if they survived the initial crisis. The next 24 hours would be crucial. She administered subcutaneous fluids to combat dehydration and gave each puppy a thorough examination. The two larger puppies were doing well, she reported. They had good reflexes and strong heartbeats. With proper care, they should make a full recovery. The third puppy was stable but would need careful monitoring. The smallest one, however, required immediate intensive care. Dr. Rodriguez set up an IV line so small it looked like a piece of thread and showed me how to monitor the puppy's vital signs. "They'll need to be fed every 2 hours around the clock," she explained. "Since they're so young, they'll need a special puppy milk replacer, I'll show you how to use a feeding syringe and how much to give each one based on their weight. As she spoke, the reality of what I was taking on began to sink in. These weren't just puppies who needed temporary shelter until they could be placed with new families. They were newborn babies who required intensive, round the clock care for weeks to come. Dr. Rodriguez must have seen the uncertainty in my face because she paused in her instructions and looked at me directly. This is going to be a huge commitment, George. Newborn puppies are like human babies. They need constant attention, frequent feeding, and medical supervision. Are you sure you're prepared for that? The honest answer was no. I wasn't prepared for any of it. I had no experience with puppies, no knowledge of animal care, and no idea what I was getting myself into. At 73, I should have been thinking about simplifying my life, not taking on responsibilities that would demand everything I had to give. But as I looked at the four tiny lives arranged in their makeshift nest, still fighting to survive despite everything they'd already endured, I knew there was only one answer I could give. These puppies had already been abandoned once. I couldn't be the second person to walk away from them. I'm prepared to do whatever they need, I told Dr. Rodriguez. Just tell me how. She smiled for the first time since arriving, and I could see the relief in her expression. She'd probably been worried that I'd realize the magnitude of the commitment and ask her to take the puppies to the animal shelter. But there was no way I was going to let that happen. For the next hour, Dr. Rodriguez gave me a crash course in newborn puppy care. She showed me how to prepare the milk replacer, how to use the feeding syringe, and how to stimulate the puppies to urinate and defecate since they couldn't do those things on their own yet. She explained the signs of distress to watch for, how often to check their temperature, and when to call her immediately. She left me with enough supplies to last several days and promised to check on us the next morning. As she packed up her equipment, she paused and looked at me thoughtfully. You know, George, most people would have walked past that tree without even noticing those puppies. The fact that you stopped, that you cared enough to get involved, that says something special about who you are. I didn't feel special. I felt terrified and overwhelmed and completely out of my depth, but I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt needed. After Dr. Rodriguez left, I set up camp in the living room. I moved my recliner close to the couch where the puppies were nestled and prepared for what I knew would be a long night. The feeding schedule meant I'd need to wake up every 2 hours to give each puppy their formula. I'd experienced sleepless nights before, during Margaret's illness when pain or anxiety kept her awake, and I'd stayed up to comfort her. But this was different. This wasn't about managing decline and preparing for loss. This was about nurturing new life, about giving these tiny creatures the best possible chance to grow and thrive. The first feeding session was a comedy of errors. The puppies were too weak to suck properly from the syringe, and I was too nervous to get the technique right. Formula ended up everywhere except where it was supposed to go. The smallest puppy barely took any nutrition at all, which terrified me. But gradually, over the course of the night, I began to get the hang of it. The two larger puppies started responding more enthusiastically to feeding time, their tiny mouths working eagerly at the syringe. The third puppy took smaller amounts, but seemed to be gaining strength. The smallest one remained my greatest concern. Each feeding was a struggle, with the tiny creature barely able to swallow even small amounts of formula. I found myself talking to that puppy constantly, encouraging it to keep fighting, to keep trying. Between feedings, I watched them sleep, marveling at how peaceful they looked when they weren't struggling to survive. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect rhythm, and occasionally they would make small sounds or movements that reminded me they were still babies, still innocent of the world that had already treated them so cruelly. As the first light of dawn filtered through the living room windows, I realized I'd made it through the night. All four puppies were still alive, still breathing, still fighting. The smallest one had even taken a slightly larger amount of formula during the 6 a.m. feeding, which felt like a major victory. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, but I was also exhilarated. I'd spent the night caring for these vulnerable creatures, and they'd responded to that care. I was making a difference in their lives, and that knowledge filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Dr. Rodriguez arrived as promised at 8 o'clock, and her examination revealed encouraging news. The two larger puppies were definitely out of immediate danger. Their temperature was normal, their reflexes were strong, and they were gaining weight. The third puppy was also improving steadily. It was smaller than the other two, but appeared to be developing normally. Dr. Rodriguez was optimistic about its chances for a full recovery. The smallest puppy remained a concern, but even there were signs of improvement. Its breathing was stronger than it had been the night before, and it had managed to take nutrition during each feeding. It was still far from out of the woods, but Dr. Rodriguez was cautiously hopeful. "You're doing an excellent job," she told me as she packed up her equipment. "These puppies are responding to your care, and that's making all the difference. Keep doing exactly what you're doing." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "George, have you thought about what you're going to do with them once they're older? 4 puppies is a lot for anyone to handle long term." I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been so focused on getting them through each hour, each feeding, each crisis that I hadn't considered what would happen once they were healthy and strong. The logical answer was to find them good homes with families who wanted puppies and could provide proper care. But as I looked at the 4 tiny forms sleeping peacefully in their nest, I realized I wasn't ready to think about giving them up. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Over the next several days, caring for the puppies became the center of my existence. Every 2 hours, day and night, I prepared formula and carefully fed each one. Between feedings, I monitored their temperature, cleaned their bedding, and provided the stimulation they needed for basic bodily functions. It was exhausting work, more demanding than any job I'd ever had, but it was also the most rewarding thing I'd done since building our house with Margaret. Every small improvement, every gram of weight gained, every new behavior felt like a major achievement. The 2 larger puppies, whom I'd started calling strong and brave in my mind, were thriving. Their eyes began to show signs of opening, and they were becoming more active during their waking periods. They would crawl around their nest, exploring with their noses and learning to coordinate their movements. The third puppy, whom I thought of as steady, was proving to be exactly that. Not the fastest to develop, but consistent and determined. It reminded me of myself in many ways, not flashy or dramatic, but reliable and persistent. The smallest puppy, whom I'd named Hope after Margaret's favorite virtue, remained my special concern. Progress was slower and less certain, but progress nonetheless. Each day brought small improvements: stronger sucking during feeding, more alert responses to stimulation, slightly better coordination. Friends and neighbors began stopping by to check on us. Word had spread through the small community about the puppies I'd found, and people were curious to see how they were doing. Some brought supplies, blankets, toys, food. Others just wanted to witness the miracle of new life being nurtured back to health. Mrs. Patterson from next door started bringing me casseroles and homemade soup, insisting that I needed to keep my strength up to properly care for the puppies. She'd lost her own husband 2 years earlier and understood the healing power of having something to care for. Young Jake Morrison, a 10-year-old from down the street, began stopping by after school to help with the puppies. His parents had initially been concerned about him bothering an elderly neighbor, but I welcomed his enthusiasm and energy. He had a natural, gentle touch with the animals and loved helping with feeding time. Dr. Rodriguez continued her daily visits, monitoring the puppies' progress and adjusting their care as needed. She was amazed by how well they were doing, particularly Hope, whose survival had been most uncertain in those first critical days. The local newspaper even ran a story about the rescue with a photo of me holding all 4 puppies. The headline read, "Man's Best Friend, Local Resident Saves Abandoned Puppies, from winter storm. The attention was embarrassing, but also heartwarming, as people reached out from all over the county to offer support and share their own animal rescue stories. What struck me most about the community response was how the puppies had brought people together. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now stopping to chat about the progress of Strong, Brave, Steady, and Hope. Children were learning about compassion and responsibility. Adults were remembering what it meant to care for something beyond themselves. By the end of the second week, all four puppies had their eyes open and were becoming increasingly active. Their personalities were beginning to emerge, and they were as different from each other as human siblings might be. Strong was indeed the strongest and most assertive. He was the first to try standing on his own legs, the first to attempt walking more than a few steps, and the most aggressive during feeding time. He reminded me of myself as a young man, confident, determined, and sometimes too eager for his own good. Brave was more thoughtful and observant. She would study her surroundings carefully before attempting new behaviors, but once she decided to try something, she approached it with quiet determination. She was often the second to achieve new milestones, but her achievements seemed more deliberate and controlled. Steady continued to live up to his name. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he was consistent and reliable. He seemed content to let his siblings take the lead while he focused on his own steady progress. There was something deeply reassuring about his calm, methodical approach to life. Hope remained the smallest and most delicate, but her spirit was becoming more apparent every day. She was curious about everything, often getting into situations that required rescue by her larger siblings. She had a way of looking at me with those bright eyes that seemed to say she remembered I was the one who had saved her, and she trusted me completely. Not everything went smoothly. During the third week, Hope developed what Dr. Rodriguez diagnosed as a respiratory infection. Her breathing became labored, she lost her appetite, and her energy level dropped dramatically. For 3 terrifying days, I thought I might lose her after all. I administered antibiotics every 6 hours, monitored her temperature constantly, and spent most of my time holding her against my chest, where she seemed to breathe easier. The other 3 puppies seemed to sense their sister was in distress. They would curl up around her during their rest periods, sharing their warmth and somehow offering comfort in the way that animals instinctively understand. During those dark days, I found myself talking to Margaret more than I had since her death. I told her about the puppies, about how much they meant to me, about how afraid I was of failing them the way I felt I'd failed her during her illness. One night, as I sat in my recliner with Hope sleeping fitfully against my chest, I could almost hear Margaret's voice telling me that I hadn't failed her, that love itself was success even when it couldn't change the outcome. She would have loved these puppies, would have thrown herself into their care with the same determination she'd brought to everything in life. On the 4th day, Hope's fever broke. Her breathing eased, her appetite returned, and the bright alertness came back to her eyes. Dr. Rodriguez pronounced her on the road to full recovery, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in days. As the puppies grew stronger and more independent, I began to face the question, "Doctor," Rodriguez had asked weeks earlier, what was I going to do with them long term? Logically, I knew that 4 dogs were more than a 73-year-old man should try to handle. Practically, I understood that each of them deserved a family who could provide the attention and care they would need as they grew into adult dogs. But emotionally, I couldn't imagine letting them go. These 4 small creatures had become my world, my purpose, my reason for getting up each morning. They had filled the empty spaces in my house and in my heart in ways I hadn't thought possible. The puppies were now 6 weeks old enough to start eating solid food and beginning to develop more independence. They still slept together in a pile most of the time, but they were also beginning to explore the house and establish their own individual territories. People started asking about adoption. Young families who had heard about the rescue wanted to know if the puppies would be available for new homes. The logical part of my brain knew this was what should happen. The puppies deserved to grow up with children to play with, yards to run in, and families who could give them the active lifestyle young dogs needed. But every time I imagined separating them, my heart rebelled. They were siblings who had survived abandonment and near death together. They trusted each other, comforted each other, and had formed bonds that seemed too precious to break. It was Jake Morrison, the 10-year-old who had been helping with the puppies, who helped me see the situation clearly. He'd been coming by every day after school, and his attachment to the puppies was obvious. One afternoon, as we watched them playing in the backyard, I'd fenced for their safety. He asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Mr. Whitman, what's going to happen to the puppies when they get bigger?" I gave him the honest answer. I wasn't sure. He was quiet for a few minutes, watching Strong and Brave wrestling over a toy, while Steady observed from a safe distance, and Hope tried to join in despite being half their size. "I think they're your dogs now," he said finally. "They don't remember whoever left them in the snow, but they remember you saving them. You're their family." Out of the mouths of babes, Jake had articulated what I'd been feeling, but hadn't been able to admit to myself. These weren't puppies I was temporarily fostering until I could find them homes. They were my dogs, my family, my responsibility, and my joy. That evening, I called Dr. Rodriguez and told her my decision. I was keeping all 4 puppies. She laughed and said she'd been wondering how long it would take me to admit what everyone else already knew. The next step was practical preparation. 4 growing dogs would need more space, more exercise, and more attention than 4 small puppies. I began planning modifications to my house and yard, thinking about the kind of environment that would keep them safe and happy as they grew. Over the next several months, my house and my life were transformed. I installed a doggy door leading to the fenced backyard and created comfortable sleeping areas for each dog while still maintaining a communal space where they could be together. I learned about dog training, nutrition, and healthcare. I established routines for feeding, exercise, and grooming. I puppy-proofed everything and discovered muscles I'd forgotten I had as I chased 4 increasingly energetic young dogs around the house and yard. The dogs' personalities continued to develop and delight me. Strong became my jogging companion, matching my slow pace perfectly and providing motivation to stay active. Brave appointed herself as the household guardian, always alert to potential threats and protective of her family. Steady earned his role as the peacekeeper, mediating disputes between his siblings and providing calm comfort when anyone was upset. Hope remained the smallest, but proved to have the biggest personality, charming everyone she met and serving as the emotional heart of our little pack. Neighbors and friends marveled at the transformation in both the dogs and me. The quiet, somewhat isolated widower had become a man with purpose and energy, constantly busy with the needs and joys of his 4-legged family. Jake Morrison remained a constant presence, and his parents eventually asked if I'd be willing to let him help out officially after school and on weekends. He was learning responsibility and compassion while giving me much-needed assistance with the increasingly demanding job of raising 4 large dogs. The ripple effect. The story of the abandoned puppies and their rescue continued to resonate throughout the community. Dr. Rodriguez told me that several other animal rescues had taken place in the months following our story being published, as people became more aware of abandoned animals and more willing to get involved. A local animal shelter started a program called Second Chances, focused on rescuing and rehabilitating animals who had been abandoned or abused. They asked if I would be willing to share my experience with potential volunteers, helping them understand what was involved in intensive animal care. The elementary school where Margaret had taught asked if I would bring the dogs for visits with the children. These sessions became monthly events, with the dogs helping to teach lessons about responsibility, compassion, and the importance of treating all living creatures with kindness. Strong, brave, steady, and Hope became therapy dogs in their own right, though they were never formally trained for the role. Their presence brought comfort to nursing home residents, joy to children in the hospital, and peace to anyone who was struggling with loss or loneliness. As I write this, it's been 2 years since that snowy February morning when I discovered four dying puppies behind an oak tree. Strong, brave, steady, and Hope are now healthy, happy adult dogs who have filled my life with more love and purpose than I ever imagined possible. People often ask me if I regret the decision to keep all four of them. The honest answer is that while the work is demanding and the responsibility is enormous, I can't imagine my life any other way. These dogs saved me just as much as I saved them. They taught me that family isn't always what you're born with or what you plan for. Sometimes family is what finds you when you need it most, what chooses you as much as you choose it. They showed me that love doesn't diminish with age, that purpose can be found at any stage of life, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to walk away when someone needs help. Margaret would have loved them. I know this with absolute certainty because I can see her qualities reflected in each of them. Strong's determination, Brave's protective nature, Steady's calm wisdom, and Hope's irrepressible joy in the face of whatever life brings. The story of four abandoned puppies might seem like a small thing in the grand scheme of human existence, but I've learned that small acts of compassion can have impacts far beyond what we can see or measure. Every person who heard our story and decided to help an animal in need, every child who learned about responsibility by helping care for the dogs, every neighbor who found community through shared concern for these four small lives, all of these represent ripples spreading outward from one moment of choice. When I saw those puppies in the snow, I had to decide whether to get involved or walk away. It would have been easier to walk away, to assume someone else would help or that nature would take its course. But I couldn't live with that choice, couldn't face another night of regret and wondering what might have been. The decision to help wasn't heroic or extraordinary, it was simply human. It was recognizing that suffering matters, that innocent life has value, and that sometimes we're called to act even when we don't feel prepared or capable. Strong, brave, steady, and Hope are now part of everything I do and everything I am. My morning walks through the park include four enthusiastic companions who remind me daily that life is meant to be lived with joy and curiosity. My quiet house is filled with the sounds of contentment, gentle snoring, the soft thud of tails against furniture, and the occasional happy bark at squirrels in the yard. I'm no longer a lonely widower going through the motions of existence. I'm a dog dad, a community member, a volunteer, and a man who wakes up each morning with purpose. I have responsibilities that matter, relationships that bring joy, and the knowledge that I'm making a positive difference in the world. The dogs have taught me that healing comes not from forgetting pain, but from choosing to love again despite the risk of future loss. They've shown me that family bonds can form quickly and grow strong when nurtured with consistency and care. Most importantly, they've demonstrated that rescue is rarely a one-way street. When you save something, it very often saves you right back. Last month, Jake Morrison called to tell me that his family had found a stray cat in their garage. Instead of taking it to the animal shelter, they decided to follow the example set by our family and nurse it back to health themselves. The cat, a pregnant female, had given birth to 5 healthy kittens under Jake's careful supervision. This is how change happens. Not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through ordinary people making conscious choices to care when caring is needed. Each act of compassion creates the possibility for more compassion. Each rescue inspires others to become rescuers themselves. When people ask me what I learned from saving those 4 puppies, I tell them the truth. I learned that love is always worth the risk, that purpose can be found at any age, and that the most important thing you can do in life is to notice when someone needs help and then provide it. Strong, brave, steady, and Hope will probably live another 10 to 12 years if we're lucky. They'll grow old with me, and eventually I'll have to say goodbye to them, just as I said goodbye to Margaret. But the love we've shared, the lessons they've taught me, and the changes they've inspired in our community will continue long after we're all gone. In my workshop, I've started building a bench for the park where I found them. It will be placed near the old oak tree with a small plaque that reads, "In memory of all the abandoned animals who were never found, and in celebration of those who were saved by someone who chose not to walk away." The bench will serve as a reminder that every life has value, that compassion is always a choice, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply stop, look, and care when the world around you seems indifferent to suffering. As I finish writing this story, Strong is sleeping at my feet. Brave is keeping watch by the window. Steady is curled up on his favorite cushion, and Hope is, as always, right beside me, her small head resting on my arm as I type. 2 years ago, I was a man who had given up on the possibility of new love, new purpose, new joy. I was simply existing, moving through each day without really living. The discovery of 4 dying puppies in the snow changed everything, not because I was particularly heroic or wise, but because I made the simple choice to care when caring was needed. That choice led to sleepless nights, enormous responsibilities, unexpected expenses, and challenges I never could have imagined. But it also led to unconditional love, daily laughter, renewed purpose, and the knowledge that I had made a difference when it mattered most. The abandoned newborn puppies who were freezing in the snow became the salvation of an elderly man who was freezing in loneliness. They reminded me that rescue is always mutual, that love multiplies when shared, and that the most beautiful families are often the ones we never planned but couldn't imagine living without. Every morning when I wake up surrounded by 4 happy, healthy dogs who greet each day with enthusiasm and joy, I'm reminded of the miracle that happens when compassion meets need. It's a reminder that will stay with me for whatever years I have left, and hopefully, through stories like this one, it will inspire others to notice their own opportunities to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to walk past the tree.